The E15 initiative, for those of you that don't already know, is focused on defining policy options to improve the global trade and investment system for sustainable development and in the context of the 21st century. So that's a big, noble vision. And we're focusing a little bit more on the 21st century aspect here today, which is e-commerce and e-commerce for development. And the E15 initiative has been doing a number of conversations over the last 12 months in Geneva and elsewhere on specifically this subject, so hopefully continuing that conversation today. Now, entrepreneurs everywhere dream of their business starting and going global. We have Mercado Libre on our panel. Mercado Libre, as François will probably tell me or remind you all later, started in 1999 with just 100 products and from a garage, if I get that right.
That's correct, yeah.
And now it's the biggest e-commerce platform in Latin America. So that's a really good success story. But we don't always hear about these success stories, and they don't always come to fruition. So how can we get more of those stories? And how specifically can the trade community help? So that's the picture that we have before us today, and I'm joined by a fantastic panel, including some small businesses that can hopefully outline some of the challenges they're facing. So we have Beitler here from who's the Integration and Senior Trade Specialist of the Inter-American Development Bank. We have Rupa Ganguli, who's the founder and CEO of Inclusive Trade. We also have François Martins, the Manager of Government Relations and Public Policy of Mercado Libre. And we have Nicolas Schubert, who's the Chief of Cabinet to Paulina Nazal, General Director of International Economic Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Chile, and Paulina sends her apologies that she can't make it here today. And finally, we have Mark Wu, who's the Assistant Professor at Harvard Law School. So with that, I'll let Adi kick it off. And just a quick word first on the structure. We're going to have each of our panelists first give us a problem pitch. So what are the problems that small businesses in developing countries concretely are encountering with e-commerce and digital trade? And I'll let each of them speak to that question in turn. And then we'll have a moment for some Q&A with the audience, so please do start thinking about your questions as the speakers are talking. And then we'll have a solution pitch, because it's all very well and good defining the problems, but let's also start defining some solutions too. So we'll ask each of the speakers to come up with what they think would be good to help address the challenges they've outlined. And then we'll ask the panelists to comment on each other's solution pitches and whether they're a good idea or not. And then finally, we'll turn it back to you all again for a bit of interaction. So with that, Adi, take it away.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. So I work at the Inter-American Development Bank, where we created a platform called ConnectAmericas.com, which is a platform of over 200,000 small business owners from Latin America. We have support from Google, Facebook, DHL, MasterCard, Alibaba. And it's mostly a directory that small businesses can find each other, find suppliers, find clients, and learn about international trade. And so I guess the problem that we are trying to solve is, how do you get the clients to trust the internet to conduct business? Is it a special level of trust that you need to put on the internet in and of itself? Does it depend on other variables like logistics, court enforcements, international coordination? Of course it does, but to what extent? And what can we do exclusively from the online aspects of this whole world of international transactions to improve market access for small businesses? Thanks.
Great. So hearing about some trust issues there. Rupa, your perspective there. Do you face trust issues? I'm sure you do, but also give us some other issues too.
Okay. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Rupa Ganguli, and I come from a trade and development background, but also a textile background. And e-commerce has actually come about as a solution or a channel to market for us. That's essentially what and how and why inclusivetrade.com came about. Now, there are a couple of issues, actually there are many issues that I could bring up, but there are a few things that I think I'd like to focus on today. One of them I have come to understand and realize, in spite of knowing some trade agreements and rules, is the fact that I think a lot of things are negotiated or built, including products made by banks or trade agreements. They sort of take into account assumptions that certain things should be in place. And as a result, what happens is when you're a very, very small business, and we work with lots of small artisans and independent small businesses to onboard them and sell online. In doing that, trust, of course, is one of the most critical factors, because if you don't trust me, you're not going to give me your credit card details and the rest of it. In doing that, I need to actually invest a lot in ensuring that I gain that trust from you. So a couple of issues, I think, is that the solutions we have today are mainly geared, I would say, keeping in mind a lot of the big businesses. And for online trade, if we want to truly focus on bringing small businesses from around the world, we work with artisans and small businesses in Guatemala, in Ethiopia, in Peru, in a number of different countries. I think one needs to rethink how trade should actually be negotiated, and keeping in mind what the real concerns of an SME really is. So I think that would be one of the key issues. That's sort of a macro, sort of, overpowering, I think, problem we have. And if I narrow that down, two areas that I would say are real priority areas are logistics, which kind of have an impact on trade facilitation, as well as mobile payments or e-payments. And that has a lot to do with a number of things, including data protection and privacy and all of that. So I think those are the areas that I would say are sort of core challenges. There are several others, but I think the trust aspect at the end of the day is you've got to believe that I'm not going to take your data and sort of use it in an irresponsible manner, and you will actually get the product that you've actually bought online. So I think getting those aspects right requires a certain level of focus on small businesses.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you for that. And I think partly with there are some elements with the trust issue that's probably more domestic, and others with the e-payments where we need to bring in a bit of the trade policy angle in the international community. But we can come to that next. François, your perspective.
The good news is Rupa said it all, I think. So I'm just going to tell you a bit about Mercado Libre. It was founded, you're right, Kimberley, in 1999 in a garage in Buenos Aires by 3 people, and then 3 months later they refounded it in Brazil. So we've been around for not so long, but we have already surpassed the $3 billion gross merchandise volume in Q3 this year, and we're growing 50% year over year. 50% of the transactions are made in mobile platforms, and the number we have, it's an estimate, but we estimate that around 350,000 families live out of revenue obtained on our platform, or on a significant part of it obtained on our platform. And what I wanted to stress here is that our platform is really basically made for business-to-consumer trade, and that is usually, it seems to me that in those multilateral events, it seems surprising. Everybody's talking so much about business-to-business trade, and this is really business-to-business is really a small amount of our business in Mercado Libre. And what I wanted to stress here is that you're probably thinking, why is this guy here? We're talking about identifying problems. Everything seems to be going just fine for Mercado Libre. 0 of that, well, it's an estimated 0, but it's close to 0, is cross-border, right? So it's mostly domestic commerce trade, right? And you could ask yourselves, why is that so, since Mercado Libre is present in 19 countries, 18 of those in Latin America, including Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Chile, Colombia. All countries, well, not all, but Chile and Colombia are good examples of countries that have opened up to the cross-border trade, and we still are not offering that service. And the main issue here that based our decision is that we're not able to provide a good experience for our customers. Our customers being three: sellers, buyers, and those who don't sell or buy anything, those who are just looking at the prices, the products, etc. And why is that so? And I think Rupa just summarized it very well. You have to manage the payment, you have to manage the logistics, and given that we have an enormous amount of business-to-consumer transactions, you have to manage the returns, which are pretty much a nightmare when it comes to cross-border trade, right? I couldn't give details about every country, but I know in Argentina and in Brazil, you have fairly strict regulations about consumers, and you have to give back 100% of the money that the consumer paid for a specific product. So if the consumer is returning the product, 100% of the money must come back, and the challenge would be to anybody here or elsewhere to say how 100% of a given amount that has crossed the border can come back through that border, given all the taxes, the intermediaries that you have to pay, etc., etc., etc. So I would state that one as my key problem. I think we need to think about the harmonization of the consumer rules, given that e-commerce is very much consumer-focused.
That's great. And one of the questions I was going to follow up with you on was how integrated is the Latin American e-commerce market? But I think you've answered that very well.
Yeah,
so instead, yeah, thank you for answering that already. Instead, I will ask you, if it was more open, do you see demand from those that are using, or have you heard from those that are using your platform that they would like to sell more regionally?
Yes, actually, we've been engaging with different governments. And for me specifically, I manage Brazil, so I've been engaging with the Brazilian government intensely on how to develop that aspect of e-commerce. And my answer has always been, it is natural for e-commerce to happen. It doesn't wait on regulations to appear and on authorizations to open the gates, right? So I'm sure there's demand. I'm sure there's somebody in Brazil trying to find a way to buy his or her wine directly from the producer in Argentina. I'm sure there's somebody here trying to buy something in Brazil, but they can't at this point. So demand, yes, there is. The thing is, how do we address that demand, and how do we allow it to thrive and develop and just exist?
Good. Well, we'll come back to that in the second part on the solutions. But Nicolas, can we turn to you for a public sector perspective on this topic?
Sure. First of all, let me thank you for the invitation. Paulina Nazal, who I'm representing, couldn't attend. She's attending other meetings a few blocks away from here. As I'm sure you're aware, Chile is a very small country compared to other countries in the region. We only have 17 million inhabitants, so we're a small market. I think that's the main problem we have, being a small market. So it's hard not to mix up the solutions with the problems. I'll do my best. But I must say that the fact that digitalization, meaning by that everything that isn't necessarily material can be transformed to ones and zeros, also represents a huge advantage for a small market like ours. And in trying to respond to the question of this panel, where can trade deals boost the enabling environment? I'll say that trade deals are able to reduce the frictions, the regulatory frictions that happen in cross-border trade. So we have a lot of things to work on. We have internal problems also. We have taxation problems. We have logistical problems. But we also have different problems cross-border from the cross-border perspective. What we have done recently is to engage those problems in our recent negotiations, and we have had a lot of good results. More Chileans are exporting now thanks to the digital economy. and yeah, well, we're trying to iron out the problems we're having, cross-border problems we're having, and it has worked very good so well.
Oh, it's good to hear, and it's good to hear particularly from your perspective, given that you, as you say, have been advancing e-commerce chapters, notably in the Pacific Alliance, but also the CPTPP as well. So maybe we'll come back to that a little bit more in your experience. And then you also mentioned data, which is one of the big issues in this area. We didn't go into a definition of e-commerce at the start of this panel. Definitions do vary, as you all know, but I would say that e-commerce, even from the B2C perspective, and looking at people nodding down here, is critical. Even if you're delivering goods physically, buying online, you need that data to flow as well. So thank you for raising that. Mark, can we turn to you? You've been doing a lot of work with both the Forum and ICTSD on e-commerce, on the enabling environment, and looking at regional trade agreements. So what's your perspective here on some of the challenges? Are these challenges insurmountable, or are we able to address them in some way?
Well, first of all, Kimberley, thank you for having me, and it's been a real pleasure to work with both ICTSD and the World Economic Forum on the E15 initiative. Over the last 2 years or so, we've been engaged in a number of different conversations with governments, with companies, and so forth, to look at what might be possible to advance trade governance in this space. And I would say there are two big problems that I would like to toss out on the table. The first is there are clearly 3 areas where the large major trading powers differ. Those 3 areas are data, privacy, and national security. And so I call these the frightful 3. And the question is, obviously, these are not the only areas that could be regulated. There is a lot that could be streamlined, harmonized, and so forth without touching these 3. But one big question is whether any of the stakeholders are happy with an agreement that doesn't touch upon or leaves these in some form of a light touch manner. So I think that's one big question, and this is part of what the conversations that are happening across the street will touch upon in terms of the scope of the e-commerce initiative at the WTO. The second question that I'd like to tee up, and this is more where the development angle comes in, is you have a number of governments, it's clear from conversations with developing countries and LDCs and so forth, where there is still a major problem just simply in terms of online digital access and digital infrastructure. And I think one other question that happens on the regulatory space is, what are the obligations of the countries that seek further treaty law or other forms of soft law on this space? What are their obligations in terms of building out digital infrastructure for the 3.5 billion or more who are still vastly offline? And related to this is another question of, for those governments that are facing these types of issues, they certainly understand the principles and the benefits of harmonization and streamlining, but we heard from some governments in conversations with the WTO, I just simply want to have a paper copy just in case, because this is the way business is being done, or I don't have the money to build out an exclusively online system, and so forth. But if you're going to have paperless trading and still require a paper copy as well, that's really taking away the benefits of all of that, right? So how do you address these large questions of digital infrastructure? How do you still continue to have respect for sovereignty and flexibility? If one country wants to mandate one authentication system, another wants to mandate another, different levels of consumer protection and so forth, while at the same time be able to reap these types of rewards. So I would say those are the 2 big questions or problems that we see.
Great, thanks so much for that. Let me turn it over to questions from the floor at this stage. Please.
My name is Carlos Braga, I'm professor at Fundação João Cabral in Brazil and IMT in Switzerland. First a comment, because I found quite interesting, particularly what I heard with respect to business to commerce problems. And many years ago, I was the manager of a program that I helped create at the World Bank called InfoDev. And for many years, I was the manager. And this program, we provided grants all over the world exactly to deal with e-commerce, internet, and we are talking 1990s. So one of the grants we gave was for a consulting company in Canada that prepared a very nice book on e-commerce. And we paid for him to go around, quote unquote, teaching the do's and don'ts of e-commerce. So he goes to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and he begins asking to the public, is there anybody already engaged in e-commerce here? And his expectation is that nobody would be, because Ethiopia at that point in time, less than 0.1% of the population had access to the internet. A guy raised his hand and said, yes. And said, how come? What are you doing? And the guy said, well, I sell goats in the internet. And he was surprised and he asked, how come? And then he explained, there is a big Ethiopian diaspora, particularly in Canada. So these people have credit cards, have access to the internet, and what they did, they put a company based in Toronto, the server, that you would buy to deliver a goat to the family in Ethiopia. So that's just a comment that prepare to be surprised, because sometimes this can totally bypass, let's say, the constraints that you are dealing with. Yeah. And just a minor aside, a few months later, I found the guy, because then I told my boss, Jim Wolfenson, this story. He went to Davos, told this story to Financial Times. It was headlines, selling goats on the internet. So I meet the guy, and I said, how is it coming in the company? And said, oh, it's doing fine. We are even selling goats now. And I said, well, weren't you selling goats to begin with? No, we were selling sheep. But since you guys said that we sold goats, demand for goats began to appear. But my question to all of you is the following. What would you expect by Wednesday in terms of decisions with respect to e-commerce next door that would make your lives different, or you really have already lost hope, like is my case? But,
are there any more questions? We'll take a couple and then turn over. If there aren't more questions, I have a couple of my own, so that you can pass on that if you don't want, if you don't want to put yourself on the line. Nonetheless, I am interested in your answer to that as well. Rupa, I would love to hear from your perspective on the internet access issue. I think Mark made a really good point there, and you do work with some communities in really rural areas. Now, I would love you to share a bit about how they're connecting to the internet and how much of it is mobile-based. Mm-hmm. And the same, François, for you, how much of this of the transactions that are going on the Mercado Libre platforms are coming through mobiles? So that would be two questions for you all. And Adi and Nicholas, please do jump in, and Mark too.
Right. So, so in terms of the first part of the question was when I'm working with the access in the different communities, right, and the access to the internet. So I think one of the things that's quite interesting, a little bit in line with what you actually spoke about right now, about your experience, is you do go into communities thinking that, you have no access to the internet. Now, strangely enough, even if they don't have, access to a computer or an internet, they do have mobile phones. And my experience, recently I've been working in Myanmar, that's Burma. And I went there in 2013, November, for the first time, and there was no mobile network, absolutely none, okay? And after living, with your mobile phone for a long time, you can't actually understand how you can't catch network anywhere. So it was quite a revelation. Fast forward about 18 months. You have 5 different providers competing for your, literally with Huawei being one of the mobile hardware providers, and bundled packages. So again, going into some of the most rural areas over there, working with people, you know that you can't actually, connect in the most sort of normal ways that you would imagine, but there are quite innovative ways that one could start thinking of. And mobile payments is actually one of the areas that we are working very closely on in terms of seeing how we could sort of leapfrog this problem, if you like, in terms of bringing money. So let's say you pay online today on the site with your credit card, and then in about 48 hours, how can we then make sure that the supplier, the Inya Lake region in Myanmar, actually gets paid using mobile technology? So using e-commerce and a couple of other things like blockchain, which I'm sure you've heard about roaming around the place, those are the kind of areas that I think are going to move forward. But talking about one stream, like this is happening, but at the same time, you know, we don't really have any harmonized framework in terms of how that should or shouldn't happen. So it's a bit like the Wild West, and like what you just said, you know, people don't wait. I mean, businesses aren't going to wait for, you know, trade agreements to be formalized. You just find a way to do it. So it's about going around, figuring it out, and then sort of, you know, finding your own solution that works for you. In terms of data protection, that is quite a big issue, actually, because we currently started with the focus of selling with a target of European Union, basically, the EU being our core market. But demand has sort of started been coming in from the United States, and we're only a year old, by the way. Actually, not yet a year old. United States and a couple of other countries. So we're structured around the EU regulatory system, and we're almost now considering having different sites for different countries, because otherwise, you get into all kinds of privacy and data protection problems, not to mention the fact that banking and payments becomes a huge issue. So I think, you know, if there was a sort of a harmonized system where one could look at how the data flows could be harmonized, what could be the regulatory framework, could the EU and the US actually agree on something so that, you know, we could potentially have the same site rather than having two different sites? Simple things like that would make a big difference.
François, let's turn to you on the mobile payments and mobile use issue.
Right. So the estimation that we have is that roughly 50% of transactions come from mobile devices. Mm-hmm. In my personal cases, it's more around 100%. I really don't use my computer anymore to go online and to shop. Right. I do it on my mobile for a very simple reason. Usually, I have the need for something and I just fulfill it right there. Right? Well, I fulfill it, meaning that I go and see the price, see if it makes sense, et cetera, et cetera. If it does, I do buy it. So the growth really is on the mobile platforms, right? We are growing on the PC platforms, the non-mobile platforms, but the growth is there. And it's not only the e-commerce thing that's growing, but the payment as well. Because we also provide payments through Mercado Pago, which is one of our BUs, and we provide payments for very brick-and-mortar commerces, such as, for instance, I pay my kid's school through an e-payment solution with Mercado Pago, right? So it really goes into the banking system, and then my money is redirected there through Mercado Pago. So we're trying to plug e-solutions wherever demand exists, and demand is everywhere. I mean, you really just need to make up your plug, and you have somewhere to plug it. So it's really easy to see that the growth is on the mobile side of things. And a good indicator of that is, and it's very particular to our region, but not only to our region, is that you cannot bring landlines to every corner of the country. Think of Argentina, think of Brazil, Mexico. You cannot get everywhere with a cable, right? So you'll get there with antennas, satellites, whatever, or wherever, and that you're going to have a mobile device to connect.
Yeah, that was going to be a follow-up question, was the extent to which that's helping communities that may not otherwise come online be actually able to not only come online, but then also trade. And I think you're nodding, so the answer is yes. Good. For Ali, Nicolas, Mark, we do also, and Rupa and François too, we do have this question on what do we expect by Wednesday? But let me also add, what would you hope for by Wednesday? And you can take that either way, because the answer may be different, I imagine. But Ali, let's turn to you first, and also jump in on the internet access issue too.
Okay, so my thinking is this. The internet itself started to grow organically from the bottom up. And it started with a few universities, and then it was extended out of the academic world to the rest of the world. And you can see many of the big internet projects like Facebook growing the same way. And what François was saying about, think about when you buy stuff, even if you are inside the same country. If you're in Argentina, you wouldn't buy from one corner of the country to the other unless it's very cheap in the logistics, which normally isn't in this part of the world. You tend to do business with people who are close to you geographically, and that's a tendency everywhere. So one of the latest thinkings we've been trying to do, at least at the IDB, is how do we frame a regulatory playing field that resembles how the internet actually evolves? How does it actually grow organically from the bottom up? And we can, so is everyone familiar with the Agile Manifesto, or should I go over it quickly?
Go over it.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the Agile Manifesto is a declaration of principles that many internet companies at one point a few years ago made, where they committed to several principles of developing technology. And the most important one is we develop nimbly with cheap solutions. We test them. We test a lot of them. We grow the ones who have reasonable prospects of evolving, and we discard the ones that don't. I see a colleague, friend from Google here. You can, to me, that's the best example. You can actually Google Cemetery to see all the projects Google didn't do or threw away, which are many more than the ones the company actually did. And so this idea, that's what technologists call iteration, constant iteration. To me, to many of us at the IEB and many other places, that kind of approach could work to get better results than what we've had so far in the regulation of the internet. And the low-hanging fruit to us is border cities. And here's why. If you consider that countries are just conventions that don't reflect how people really feel, if, for example, they live in border cities, and you can go anywhere in Latin America, possibly anywhere in the world, people who live in border cities that are used to doing business and meeting socially and exchanging life experiences together, they don't see each other as like he's from another country. They have a lot more social interaction than people from two capital cities in those same countries. So one of the things we're starting to do is test how could we start small with, I don't know, B2C deliveries in two border cities, allowing them to do business internationally. But it's internationally only by regulation, but not because of the social environment they're in. And the sellers and buyers are close enough so that if you have to return something, you can. And there are special sandboxes for people living in border areas that you can return stuff more easily, the logistics come in and out. So it's interesting to test it, at least from the bottom up. And you would get, like, if people ask why, how far along are we in the multilateral conversations, and people express frustration and skepticism about the possible results. If we try to iterate in border areas using regulatory sandboxes to see, okay, let's not commit to a full liberalization and data exchange and security agreements, but let's just try it at the border. And as we learn how it works, we can scale it up to the rest of the countries. That to us seems like a more sensible approach to getting something out of the next days in the meetings.
Very interesting. Nicolas, let me put you on the spot here a little bit. Sure. Are we going to have an agile WTO by Wednesday? What's the state of play in the e-commerce context?
I hope we do. I hope we do. Well, it is very odd for us that the WTO isn't talking about these issues a long time ago. We still have, we're still working on a mandate, on the mandate that was given by ministers in 1998. And we have made very few movements towards...
Just one thing, 1998, 1 year before,
Mercado
your
Libre
business
was
started.
Before the
interesting
the small business went global. Yeah, very interesting.
And we have made very few progress. So Chile, well, our position is we expect that the WTO can engage in more conversations, having in mind all the different views there are on the room. But we feel we need to move forward. I was telling before that digitalization has been a very enabling fact for us in Chile, and we believe that those that are concerned about development can seize the opportunity of digitalization. Of course, that comes along with the need to get access to the internet, and not only penetration rates are important, but also the quality of the connections are important. Yeah. And sure, mobile technologies have enabled us to get more people connected at better speeds. But we need also to engage in conversations about the regulatory environment. What we have done in our recent FTA negotiations is to focus on 3 main areas. We have focused on cross-border data flows, and I'm going to explain why. We have focused on importing the non-discrimination elements of the general WTO laws into the digital agenda, and we have also we are also working on non-localization mandates. We believe that the internet has been a very enabling environment because it has served as a platform, and we believe that trade agreements can serve the purpose of keeping the internet that way. That means the internet should continue to be a neutral space, so everyone can compete on this platform, and well, the consumers can choose among the best products, the best services that they can get. Schumpeter explains this better way than I could ever do, but there is some sort of the destructive creation going on the internet that has been very good, at least for us, and we believe that's the way forward. That perhaps the WTO should look into that to seek a way forward. Of course, there are many questions on the table, but we believe we should be talking more on this at the WTO.
Good. Creative destruction with flanking policies, I hope. So, Mark, let me maybe put you even more on the spot. Let's ask you from your academic perspective, what really is the landscape now that you're seeing there? Concretely, what do you actually expect for Wednesday in a realist scenario? And how does that measure up with what you'd actually like to see from the work that you've been doing?
Well, Carlos had warned me that he was going to come sabotage the panel and toss difficult questions, but I didn't expect them to land this way.
Well, you're at the end there, so you've got to catch.
And we see there's a 2-finger in back there, Kimberley. So
sure, let's take the 2-finger. Go for it.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Professor Chang from Fudan University, Shanghai, China. I'm very interested in the topic today, and in particular, I have a question referred to my colleague, Professor Marco Wu from Harvard Law School, and You mentioned the three dimensions for the e-commerce and the data and privacy and security. But I'm wondering because now it's interesting for the cross-border e-commerce, not domestically. And for example, in China, many consumers made an order by the mobile phone and mentioned by the speaker, mostly by the mobile phone, not by the PC, and more easy payment also by the mobile phone. But that's the consumer, not for the, normally we talking about the trade by the company, B2P, B2B, not a B2C, whatever. So that's traditionally two categories, business to business and business to consumer. But now, it seems to me, for the consumer, pursue the goods across the border is a huge number of the volumes. Take example, in China, we call it single day, 11 November, that's the single day. Now it's a shopping day, a global shopping day, and e-commerce giant Alibaba and other Chinese giant and make this day is a shopping day. So it's millions and millions. But the problem is that I wondering for Professor, would you make the further explanations, because it's not for trade. Normally trade is for the consumer, but for the 1998 mentioned the speaker, the 1998 WTO in the Geneva made the declaration on the global e-commerce, and the policy that it's zeroing telephone on any e-commerce, and that's the policy remain unchanged because no agreement concluded since then, lasted virtually 20 years. But now in China, we found that the government imposed the policy for the limits of the consumer buying goods abroad, because if you reach the certain amount of the goods, makes equivalence of the trade, because it's difficult to distinguish the consumer buy the goods and the company buy goods, because the amount of the goods is huge. So how to make the regulatory policy for such kind of e-commerce across border and related to the WTO policy 20 years ago. I particularly refer to Mark. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let me take both Professor Zhang's question and Professor Primavaga's question and sort of tie in on this, right? I think one thing that we should all be on the lookout for Wednesday is whether or not the e-commerce moratorium gets extended. This has played an important role, not just B2B, but also cross-border B2C trade. And it's normally been rolled over at each ministerial. I would hope, if you ask me, Kimberley, what I would like to see happen, I would hope that at the very least this will be extended and not held hostage to other elements, but we shall see on Wednesday. Beyond this, right, Professor Zhang alluded to the fact that the current mandate touches on certain trade-related elements. And that does touch on, I think if we were to take what we think of as e-commerce or digital trade, and we disaggregated this into three different parts, right? There is digital trade in pure cross-border services that don't involve any goods, right? There is digital trade in that provides some form of enabling service, but at the end of the day, you're still moving a physical good. Both of those are touched upon as part of the current, even under the 1998 framework, when there's a cross-border element that comes into play. Some of this happens, right, in the GATS negotiations. The other part, right, when there's a digital service that's involved, but it touches upon a physical good. I think even as academics, we have debates about whether or not this falls into GATT versus GATS realm, but it's certainly both GATT and GATT's regulations affects all of that, right? And then on top of this, you always have the possibility to tax these types of transactions, which again touches on a trade-related element. All of this can currently function under the current mandate. I think the problem comes in, as I mentioned, there's three parts to this, right? The third part is these worlds are blurring ever more so, and then particularly in a world where data is especially becoming more and more important, and data is the key element that helps to facilitate the algorithms that make this more and more efficient. And then you have payment systems and so forth which feed off of these types of algorithms. Then it becomes a question, the one that Professor Zhang alluded to, right, which is the types of regulations that you see governments undertaking, are those trade related or not? So say, for example, if you need to have certain disclosure of certain algorithms just to check on whether or not certain privacy regulations or security regulations are being violated, does that touch upon trade or not? Right? Traditionally, right, that's not something that's being traded upon, but it does affect a lot of cross-border trade. And here's where I would hope that there would be some ability at some point, although I'm doubtful Wednesday per se, but maybe we can take small baby steps in this direction to have a more efficient conversation inside the WTO that allows us to tie some of these elements together. Because today is still living in that 1998 distinction between goods and services without really considering data and these types of what's truly behind the border or not behind the border regulations, right? That conversation isn't even being allowed to happen per se, and we need at least some conversations to happen before we can decide where do we move on to resolve the types of questions that were touched upon. I don't know whether we'll be there on Wednesday. There are lots of different configurations, including just a recognition in some form of a statement of this issue and the continuation of possibly saying, addressing this issue further, but I leave that to the diplomats to work out.
Thank you for that, Mark. So I think we were starting to move there a little bit into the solutions. What can we do about all these problems? So I'm going to turn to each speaker again to kind of dive into that. But in the interest of creative disruption, I'm going to switch it around. So I'm going to start with Mark and move back down along, but also because I would like to pick up a little bit on what you were saying there. I was getting the sense that you don't think by Wednesday we're going to have a beautiful working party focusing on all aspects of e-commerce and data flows, assuming that is not the case. What is the step forward for both internationally, for governments that are interested in making those collaborations on regulatory coherence elements or on data flows? And then what's the role for those of us on the outside looking in who are desperate to see some of these issues move forward?
Well, as all of you in the private sector know, right, this world is moving ahead, technology is moving ahead, whether governments, lawyers, and so forth keep a pace or not, right? And there are problems that are surfacing regardless of whether or not we choose to tackle them in the WTO or you choose to tackle them in the APEC or whatever the case is going to be. And these things always have some form of a natural order to it. So I think if it doesn't happen at the multilateral level, you will start to see more regional or even bilateral arrangements. You already see this, right? Say, for example, right, the EU has a number of different privacy regulations. You see this with the Pacific Alliance, right, wanting to sort of work together, and you see this in different parts of Asia moving forward. But beyond all this, what I draw everyone's attention to is the private sector will find ways to address its business inefficiency issues, and this can happen through private sector standard setting bodies, through setting norms. And the question that I would surface for all of us, especially since this is an e-commerce for development forum, is that may very well be a very efficient solution, but what are the development elements that would not be taken care of in that type of outcome world? And where do you then need government to step in? And would you prefer that to be just done on a case-by-case sovereign basis, or would you like for there to be regulatory cooperation issues that are addressed at a multilateral level?
Now, I know you're an academic, so I know you like asking rhetorical questions, but I'm going to throw that question back at you, because this is an e-commerce for development panel, and I think you raised a very good question. So in that context, what would you do, and what kind of engagement needs to happen to make sure that this is a development issue, that this is a development conversation, and that certain countries don't pull ahead and actually we end up with a digital chasm?
Well, we've been stuck in the 1998 framework, right, for the last 2 decades. We've seen rapid innovation that's drawn billions of people online, that's allowed MSMEs to really tap into the global marketplace. So I think there will be some very positive developments that will happen because of the innovation, because of the market opportunities and so on and so forth, right? But it still comes down at the end of the day to spending power, and especially for the large-scale infrastructure investments that are necessary, right? To be able to tap into all of this. That still requires some forms of cooperation, and I also think where you have regulatory barriers that prevent certain goods from crossing markets, or have financial regulations that don't allow certain people to take full leverage of e-payment systems and so forth. That's really where you need these types of regulatory interventions to take place. And business can go a long ways towards solving many of these problems, but not all the way in terms of the roadblocks that can be thrown up by governments.
Great, thank you. Nicolas, from your perspective, you mentioned that Chile has been looking at growing cross-border e-commerce. We know that Chile's been putting e-commerce chapters into trade agreements. Can you tell us a bit about that journey and what it's meant for Chile, what it's meant for the business in Chile, and again, including that development perspective too, what can other economies learn from that?
Sure. Well, as you said, we have been working on a lot of negotiations that include e-commerce chapters, and those chapters we have included the three main areas I just mentioned. That's data flows, no localization requirements, and getting the same treatment that physical products get to the digital arena. Those are the three main areas we have been working on. And well, everyone that is involved in regulation, in regulating technology, knows that it's very hard. Because technology moves forward way much faster than we lawyers can get behind it. And what we have done is to regulate a certain framework that allows technology to develop inside this framework. And what we have always had in mind is this enabling technology that the internet is. And we seek to address the trade issues, the development issues, having in mind that the internet is a platform, and the internet should be a platform and should keep as a platform in the future. And in doing so, we have had in mind, and I'm sorry if I'm being too geeky here, but we believe that the internet's original architecture is something that we should have in mind when we talk about trade issues and regulatory issues. The architecture is also a way of regulating. Not only trade law is a way of regulating, but also the architecture is a way of regulating. So one has to be very, very, very thoughtful of how the architecture affects trade and the environment, the competitive environment that it creates. So we should keep the internet open, and we should, in order for it to allow as many competitors as it can handle.
Super.
Yep.
Quick follow-up question. So I know that Chile is a member of the Friends for E-commerce for Development group at the WTO, and that you're also doing a lot of SME work at the WTO and pushing that forward. Can I ask you just to elaborate both on those for folks in the room who might not know what those groups are working on, and what are they trying to achieve, and why are you bringing that conversation, or what's the outcome for that conversation here at the WTO?
Sure. Well, Chile is coordinating a group on SMEs right now at the WTO. That's an initiative we had because in our country we're only 17 million inhabitants, so and SMEs are a very important part of our economy, and we feel that digital trade is a way to boost the way SMEs can compete in a global world. So there is a direct link between SMEs and digital trade, but also regarding gender issues. I mean, the internet is a way for more women and those that have not been able to participate in global trade to participate more, and that's the view we're bringing into the WTO negotiations this week.
Good. Well, we'll see where we land on Wednesday. François, from your perspective, have you seen effective government intervention to help with that cross-border market? I'm sensing the answer is probably no, given the amount of cross-border commerce, but you've been watching some of this space for a while, so what's best practice in your view?
Well, I was about to talk about Chile, but that has been addressed. So Chile has very good examples of free trade agreements negotiated, and that I think is a very good step, following a bit on the idea of Adi, saying that you cannot address the issue of cross-border trade in a planetary environment, right? You need to start with small steps and take it one after the other, and so you need to address it. And one of the discussions we're having with the Brazilian government in this point is maybe Brazil should start getting a bit closer to Argentina. You know, they share a border, they share a lot of the inefficiencies in their economies, they share a lot of the same problems in their infrastructures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this might be a good point to start. Not saying that Chile shouldn't be a good option, but Chile has less inefficiencies. And that brings me to the other topic that I think is important, is that this issue that we're discussing here, trade, cross-border trade, is really a domestic issue. You cannot go abroad if you don't have the competitiveness you need inside your own borders. You have to build up the actors, your domestic actors, so they can go abroad and really actually compete with those they will find when they cross the border. So it's really no use to discuss that if you're not working inside your own borders to do what you need to do to build the ecosystems to go abroad. That doesn't mean that you need to suspend all discussions. That's exactly not what I'm saying. That's the contrary, really. You need to do both things at the same time, in our opinion.
That's a very good message. A quick follow-up question, because we were focusing there on the governments. What about from the business perspective? From you're a large platform, you have a number of SMEs trading on it. Do you do anything to enable the competitiveness of those SMEs, even just at the domestic level?
Yes, we actually do. You know, Mercado Libre started as a place where you could sell and buy used things, and usually you had no fixed price. Now, around 90% of what is sold is new, and 95% is at fixed price. So we're really changing the way we do business in Mercado Libre, and in the beginning, we only had the platform to sell and buy things. Now you have the payment solution, we have a fulfillment solution, we have a publicity solution, advertisement solution. We have all sorts of solutions that we put in place as we went on growing our business and identifying the bottlenecks that were being put in our sellers' and users' roads. So. At first, we didn't think that would be necessary. You know, you need to pay something, there's cash, there's banks, there's credit cards, go ahead and pay. And then suddenly it is an issue. All right, so how can we help our sellers and our buyers, because we have all those users, not only sellers, how can we help them better connect? So here's an e-payment solution. And, you know, offering that sort of solution is really opening an enormous interface with regulators, because you have to really disrupt the market and disrupt the regulation and disrupt the minds to tell people, hey, the banking system is not enough. I'm just taking the payment as an example, but you could apply that to the logistics systems, to any other type of thing you could imagine around e-commerce. So you have to tell people, hey, the banking system is not enough. The banking system does not want to go there. The demand is there. If they're not there, it's because they don't want to go there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we've been developing all these solutions, and really what we need to do now, as I was mentioning in the beginning, is we need to be able to get countries to speak to each other so they can better understand each other, harmonize things so we can offer those solutions in a cross-border manner. Because, you know, we have Mercado Pago in Brazil, we have Mercado Pago in Argentina, but they cannot really talk because there's regulation in Brazil, there's regulation in Argentina, and although for us it's the same solution, and it's really a technology development issue which is not so difficult to manage, we cannot make them speak and talk. You know, you have your wallet in Brazil, you have your wallet in Argentina, and you cannot transfer money between your wallets. That's not really for us to manage, although we're 100% invested in helping do that.
Good. So again, it sounds like there's a need for work on multiple fronts there. Rupa, from your perspective, well, both from Rupa's perspective as to what types of capacity building or what types of rules or whatever it is that you would find useful from your more platform perspective, but then also share maybe from the perspective of the suppliers that you're working with, what would they find useful?
Right. So, you know, as I mentioned before, inclusivetrade.com came about as a solution, literally, as an online platform to enable a lot of the small suppliers that we were working with across the world in reaching international markets. So let me just sort of, you know, literally draw the lines. The main thing over here for us has been development, in a sense, working on building relationships with our small suppliers, and we have about 6 countries for the time being that we're working with. The core has been in trying to ensure that these small suppliers become competitive, and as a result, we become competitive. That's essentially how it works. They win, we win. And of course, the consumer then gets the best price. Now, in making all of that happen, as you can imagine, 6 countries, us being the 7th, plus all the logistics, payments, and everything. So we've had to be quite innovative in the beginning in keeping things as simple and choosing the countries we work with so that we could actually benefit from trade agreements. Now, if we just picked any 6 countries in the world, unfortunately, we can't do that right now simply because of trade restrictions. I mean, you don't have duty-free access everywhere in the world. Rules of origin are quite complicated, to say the least. So if you start exporting product, let's say one product from country A to country B to country C, transshipped in country B, the rule of origin can get quite complicated for a small supplier. The number of documents you have to fill up gets even more complex. And finally, you as a consumer are going to land up paying more because someone has to pay for it, right? So I think that's basically the simple version of what we're trying to do. Now, if you break that up into, let's say, at least 2 components, where we've got a supply side and we've got a market side. Right? So the supply side, what would be really good for us, as in inclusive trade, as in me, would be to be able to work with any supplier that has a potential product that we can sell. And I shouldn't have to worry about, oh, well, actually, that country, if I work with Brazil, for instance, to try and import from Brazil to export again, I'm going to be hit by tariffs twice. That doesn't make sense. Therefore, oh, my goodness, let me not work with Brazil right now. That should not be my decision. My decision should be great pair of shoes. I want to onboard them. I should be able to do that. So on the supply side, I should not have to make a decision based on trade restrictions. On the buying side, you as a consumer want to have the easiest way. Unfortunately, today, the demand from consumers has become so high. I don't say unfortunately. Well, it's unfortunate for a small platform, but it's a great thing. But at the same time, the pressure on small e-commerce platforms is pretty intense because you still want the best price, you still want it tomorrow, and you still want a great product. So I mean, how do you get all of that together? So our solution currently is in building a relationship with you. We don't want to sell to you. We're not even trying. We're just saying, you know what, get to know us, see the impact you can have on the products that you're buying, and look at where that impact is actually having a real life case. And that's what we're bringing to the front. And so from a consumer perspective, we want to make it as streamlined and smooth for you to make your payments, to see the transparency of the chain, and to be, to feel safe that I'm not going to take your data and sell it out to someone else. So there's the trust aspect on this side. There should be the aspect of freedom of choice on the other side. So I think streamlining these 2 elements is probably going to help a lot more small businesses to get online, because these are some of the key issues you have today in terms of sort of restrictions, barriers to entry, really. And the last thing I'd say is that, well, I'm not sitting, next door at the trade negotiations at this point, so I can't possibly say anything. But it is a bit, I don't really know what the word is, but it's almost amazing that it's been 20 years and we haven't come to any kind of concrete decision. There's no agreement. It's not GATT, it's not GATT. We have another issue with the textiles and clothing sector because there are certain products which fall within chapters 61 and 62 in the HS harmonized system. Now, the moment you start having technological innovations in garments, for instance, you're not sure whether it's actually categorized as clothing or it's categorized as an electronic good. And as a result, that creates a whole set of issues with what is the applicable tariff and then again rules of origin. So, I mean, honestly, there's so many different aspects to this. I think harmonization, transparency, and real dialogue to ensure that the real participants are a part of the discussion. Because otherwise, it's like coming and telling me what I need without actually asking me what I want. So I think that's essentially where it should go.
I'm just going to follow up with you because I know that we've had conversations about the nature of the WTO and the extent to which you think it's built for big businesses. And tell us a little bit more about that. How could we imagine a WTO plus that's maybe more small business centered, and what's the real issue there from your small business perspective?
See, now I'm going to get kicked out, right? So
it's okay, you're not across the
No, I'm not across the river. I did start out at the WTO though, so that's where I started. So my view right now is that I think the more you read about the trade agreements, whether it's the GATS or the GATT, or it's the TRIPS, or whether it's even the working committee right now, a lot of it is based on thinking about cross-border trade, and I think it's been said a couple of times, at the country level or at a conglomerate level, at a very big business level. And I absolutely reckon the fact that Chile is right now sitting on an SME committee, that's amazing. But at the end of the day, most of the agreements are negotiated keeping in mind that there's some assumptions about things being in place, which only happen in big businesses, because small businesses quite often will probably need to take some of the trade agreements and turn it around on its head and start from scratch. So I almost think that an SME, if it's special and differential treatment, or if it's duty-free, quota-free, whatever it is, all of that needs to have a specific element focused on SMEs, or let me rephrase that, one needs to rephrase some of the terminology to ensure that it makes sense for SMEs. Because some of the issues that SMEs have, such as simply getting access to finance, let's say, just very, very simple stuff, simple access to finance, negotiating power. I mean, your negotiating power on even having collaborations with cross-border businesses is zero, because you're so small. How can you negotiate the best rates when you're being dictated with, anti-dumping, and all of that is great when you're a massive, company, but when you're a small company, you just take it. You're just a taker. You're not negotiating anything. So I think if there's a true focus on SMEs, then I think this is a good time to start looking at the online and e-commerce mechanism to try and see how can we really think about that small business sitting in, let's say, Guatemala City, or in one of, a small little town in Myanmar, and what exactly do they need to really do international trade?
Yeah, it's a very good vision. Adi, so you talked a little bit about the solutions that IDB is bringing to the table at the start, but can I ask you to dive into those a little bit more, particularly in hindsight of all the problems that we've surfaced here? And then also you mentioned the private sector partners that you work with, and to what extent do you see public-private collaboration being an effective channel?
So what we see, we're trying it out. We're not saying it's the solution, but it seems that it resembles many of the things that went right with the internet and many of the things that went wrong with multilateral conversations on trade, which is you want to grab too much, you're assuming so many things. When you sit on the table, as everyone is pointing out, we're assuming we speak on behalf of small businesses, and we normally have big businesses in mind, because that's where we come from, the negotiators, academics. And it's a grand bargain, and it's so hard to reach. Whereas if you flip the methodology and you start with regulatory sandboxes in border cities, that would be that's what we are testing now, and it's really interesting what's going on, because you start learning from the bottom up and how small businesses relate to the connectivity issue. For example, in Latin America, it's very hard to say that what you need to do is provide more access in terms of connectivity. We've surpassed the 50% barrier. We are below the 5% of living cost threshold, so it's cheap. But still 49% of people don't use it, but it's not because they can't use it, it's because mostly the local content is really bad. So it's like, I don't have an incentive to go anywhere to the internet to look for stuff, because there's nothing interesting for me. So you learn new things as you go from a bottom-up perspective. And as Mark was saying, because we are unlikely to obtain meaningful results this year, or for that matter, I don't know how many years along the road, because of the approach we're taking, bilateral agreements are going to start flourishing again, and maybe smaller regional agreements. And that's when you can experiment with certain areas that can give you meaningful information about what really goes on.
That's good. Maybe, so I was going to ask you all to comment on each other's, but maybe I'll try and bring some of you into comment specifically on that. But Rupa, from your perspective, is bilateralism the way forward? Would that be helpful? And I think we're talking about different types of bilateralism here. So there's FTAs, and then what you're talking about is slightly more agile governance. So maybe comment on both of those with that.
I think bilaterals can be interesting. I mean, obviously, I'm now wearing a hat looking at e-commerce and looking at, online trade. And I think, as you mentioned, especially with border cities, if I just take a place where I've lived myself, which has been in Geneva for many years, and you had Ferney, which is a border city with France and Geneva. I mean, obviously, there's a lot more sort of understanding of people who live there with the existing city that they shop in and they do all their work in, rather than maybe Paris, because Ferney is France, but it's actually, well, it's kind of end of, Geneva. So, there seems to be a lot of, that could be a small test model. Having said that, I almost think that it shouldn't become constrained in saying that, well, if there are only 5 million people living here, or I don't know, 5,000 people, whatever it is, living there, then really that's the only market I've got, Whereas with online, the key, I suppose, the way I see online is it's opening doors. It's literally opening up the world to you. And it's almost like saying that little business in Furness should actually have access to United States. And because that's a much bigger market for him, maybe, because the product he makes is better perceived or more value in the United States. I'm just making this up, obviously. But I think, the thing with online, I personally think, it's sort of opening a window to the world. And if we sort of restrict ourselves in looking at a smaller space, you might come up with constraints which may not really be real in the long run, simply because you may have a consumer sitting somewhere else who's absolutely willing to pay the price and sees higher value. But that's just commenting at this stage.
Let me turn it over to Mark, who I know has been doing quite some work on what's actually in the FTAs. So, Mark, we're not terribly optimistic about where the WTO is going with this agenda by Wednesday. So, why bother? Why are we pushing the agenda here at the WTO on the e-commerce issue? We've got quite a lot covered in the FTAs. Tell us about what's in those. But then your thoughts on whether it's worth pushing multilaterally or not.
Well, within the FTAs, we see various different flavors, right? So on the one end, I'd say there is a set of countries that includes the United States, Australia, Singapore, number of different outward-facing countries in Latin America, including Chile, right, Pacific Alliance countries and so forth, that really have been pushing not just the digital trade facilitation issues, but looking at issues about data, about some of the payment-related services stuff, right? These are the deep comprehensive agreements. You have a European model, which touches more on cooperation and touches on some of the digital trade facilitation issues, but doesn't go quite as deep into the behind the border. And then you have what I would characterize as more light touch, touches on some of the either simply authentication types of issues or about regulatory cooperation, regulatory exchange, these types of issues, but much lighter touch. Those are the different flavors of RTAs in this area. All of these are helpful in terms of pushing further beyond what we see in existing WTO rules, but I think part of the reason that people would still like to have some conversation and discussion here at the WTO is on one issue, like say the e-commerce moratorium, just much easier for business to plan around one set of expectations. But even on these other forms of issues, I think there's just a sense that this is where trade is moving. And if the leading multilateral institution in the world is going to abrogate its responsibility to touch on all of this, then the value of doing all of this through one multilateral institution is going to dissipate. And this will come to resemble much more a world of what the investment regime looks like, a series or web of interlaced agreements without a firm dispute settlement element. And I think for many people, what people have loved about the WTO, right, is that robust sense of a multilateral institution. And I think that's why there's a commitment here to say, like I said, right, business can do it, regional trade agreements can do it, and so forth. But there is a commitment to saying what we've done over the last 2 decades particularly, but right, the last 75 years has been really valuable in this space. And do we really want to give that up for the next frontier of trade?
Great, good answer. Let me just turn to the floor to see if there's any questions before coming back to our last 2 panelists here. So questions, ask them now or hold your peace. Good, no more questions. Seems like we've got everything fixed, guys. Well done. But François, please, let's turn over to you.
While people think about their questions, I just wanted to stress one point. I couldn't make any assumptions about what is going to happen from today until Wednesday. Although I would hope that we could start facing the e-commerce matter a bit more seriously. The impression I get is that we're kind of dodging the issue, and the issue is just moving on. I mean, e-commerce is out there, and it will exist, and it will function, and it will, I mean, there's no escaping this. But my point here is that the multilateral system that the WTO represents has a lot to bring to this conversation and to the building of the e-commerce ecosystem as we can imagine it. And the point being that e-commerce is commerce. It is trade. You can remove the E. You're not doing anything radically different than what has been done for the past decades, right? X decades. So this is what the WTO can bring to the table. You don't need to reinvent everything just because you're discussing e-commerce. What you need to do is you need to think differently, because e-commerce is different. That E is just one letter, but it has a big impact. But you're not discussing something that is so fundamentally different that you need to rebuild an entire different bilateral, multilateral, I don't know, regional thing. You can use what's there.
Tell us a bit about that, think differently.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you're probably referring to what we were discussing earlier today. Yeah. So one issue that I've been discussing a lot lately is that in several fora, international fora, national, regional, etc., people tend to discuss the internet as an object that is subject to regulation. And there's, for me, there are 2 fundamental errors in that assumption. The first of all is that regulation underpins the idea that you need to stop something from happening. And that is, first of all, I think it's impossible. Second of all, I think you don't necessarily need to stop things from happening. You probably need to encourage things so they will happen. You could mention women in e-commerce. You could mention accessibility to connectivity, millions of things that you don't want to regulate, you want to really enhance, and you want them to flourish. So there's the first problem with that statement. The other statement is that the internet is not something, it's not an object, it's an environment, and you have things happening in there. So you don't need to address the environment. What you need to address really is the activity happening in there, right? So what we're discussing here is not really the internet, is trade, commerce, payments. Okay, there's an E. The E is the new way things are being done. It's not the center of the discussion. It's not the core problem that needs to be addressed. It's not even a problem. So I think there's a fundamental disruption that needs to happen in the way we look at things when they touch the internet, because the internet is not really the issue at hand. In my opinion, and this is coming from a large e-commerce platform, the internet is not an issue. It's really a solution. Issues are elsewhere. Don't necessarily need to be regulated or limited or restricted. They probably need to be enhanced, promoted, and addressed in a broader way.
So E is a new way of things being done, and we need to look at that in the trade context, in summary.
Correct.
Good. So I'm going to turn to each speaker for a very... Oh, we have a question.
I have not, Amy Porges. I just have not a question but an observation. What's the most striking thing about the e-commerce agenda this year is, I compare it to where it was 15 years ago. 15 years ago, there were a small number of developed countries, basically the US, the EU maybe, pushing for this. But now, the names on those proposals are so diverse. The lead countries of the proposals are also so diverse. There are different formulations, but everyone is interested in e-commerce to some extent. And why is it happening? Why has this diversified? Because of external developments in the market. I really think this is a market-led initiative. It's happening, it's diversifying because the internet, online-powered businesses have diversified, and they are everywhere. Therefore, all governments are interested. And that is such a difference from where we were 15 years ago.
Absolutely.
So even if it doesn't go through this year, I have great hope for the future.
I'm glad to hear that there's hope. I think it's not only market-driven, but almost reality-driven in many respects.
Yeah.
I'm glad the panel agrees. So let me turn to our panel for just a quick 1 minute. Your top takeaway, what are you going to walk away from this panel? What should the audience in the room walk away with, keep in mind over the coming 48 hours as we move towards that Wednesday close of the ministerial? And beyond, apparently. Mark, let's start with you.
I'm going to reframe your question a little bit beyond 48 hours to say not just the next 2 days, but the next 2 years and for e-commerce and development. I think one big question we should all ask ourselves, or we should all say, is I think to Amy's point, right, the market is going to take care of several of these facilitation types of issues. It already has, it already will continue to. The one dividing line that I see here is on data. I think data is we're going to see differences amongst the major trading powers, and you're also going to see differences between different countries within the developing world. It's already the case here today or not. And the question that I leave for us all to think about is it truly necessary to have robust data regulation in order to advance development? And if so, draw that link for more governments to understand what's in it for them.
Good. So market-driven, but what to do about data? Nicolas, your perspective.
Sure. Well, the discussion we're having now at the WTO is 20 years old, but it's just starting. And the key thing I would like to highlight is that we must keep in mind the technical correlation between the internet, I mean the cables and the poles and everything, and yes, the environment. The internet is an environment, but it's also affected by the architecture and the technical aspect of it. So we as trade people should be also very, very happy to have in mind how the technical architecture impacts trade as a regulator. The technical architecture is perhaps a better regulator as law itself.
Great. Good lesson for the trade community there. François.
I'll just repeat something I've heard in a panel just before this one. A person said that in these environments where we discuss international trade, we always say that we're in a multi-stakeholder environment. Well, and this will sound strange coming from the guy from a company, but I think we're very much immersed in a multilateral environment with a lot of public sector influence and mindsets, and we probably need to get more of the multi-stakeholder elements connected to the discussion. And this is not something completely ethereal. What I mean by this is there's no way of getting a hold of the actual problems that pertain to having no connectivity at all, having no electricity, don't knowing how to deal with the paperwork, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, if you don't ask the right people who are actually facing those troubles. And these people are not in the public sector. So you actually need to have everybody around the table.
Great. Policy making informed by multi-stakeholder dialogue from the World Economic Forum. I very much like that answer. Yes. Thank you. Rupa.
Well, so much has been said. The one thing that I'd really like to say, I mean, there's a lot of discussion going on. It needs to finally be visible. The impacts and the actual outcomes of these discussions and decisions need to be visible to the SME community. And it needs to be in a language that most people understand. Because if it's in sort of long, big trade journals, and I know a lot of technical assistance is available, but unfortunately it still isn't as visible as it could be. So I think there needs to be, if there's a really interesting outcome, this needs to actually feed back using the institutional sector as well, such as academia and other meso-level players, whom I don't really see that many of. You know, it's more the civil society and the WTO and the international organizations, but I think there needs to be that other level of national players who need to get involved so that it actually starts becoming a reality in the proper languages and whatever it needs to be to actually make a difference to those SMEs who need it the most. So I think a lot more interaction and participation or active engagement of national players.
Great. We're talking in a language for regular people.
Yeah.
Ali, you have the last stand here.
Yeah, so I guess my message would be when we all realize on Thursday that it didn't, if it didn't go as we expected, then let's think of how the internet developed in the first place to see how we can develop the regulations for the internet. Start small, test and iterate, and start small again, and then test again, and then iterate again, and maybe we can get somewhere better than we are now.
Super. Thank you very much. Will you join me all in thanking our panel? Thank you very much.